Hello, BookTube, and welcome to our reading of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. We are roughly at the halfway point of the book, which means, as Elizabeth points out, that it's time to release the velociraptors. It is now time for the slightly sleepy pace of this book to start changing. So be prepared if you're walking through it with me for the first time. First of all, if you are one of the people that gets in touch with me regularly now that says that they have never read this book before, or that maybe they read it grudgingly and don't remember anything of it from high school, and they are going through it chapter by chapter with me, not reading ahead, experiencing this for a brand new release. First of all, I want to say thank you all very much for that. It is thrilling to go through this with you. And second, if you are doing that, prepare yourself because things are not going to stay sedate. We are up to chapter 32, and this chapter is an exercise, a rhetorical masterpiece in restraint. So let's see how buttoned down things are before they explode all over the place. So this is chapter 32. Keep in mind the scene here is that Elizabeth Bennet, our heroine, is at Hunsford Parsonage. She is visiting Charlotte Lucas, now the wife of Mr. Collins. She is a regular guest at the house next door, Mr. Collins's patron, the Lady Catherine de Bourgh, who is the aunt of Mr. Darcy. And to make matters even more strained and contentious, Mr. Darcy and his cousin, Colonel Fitzwilliam, have arrived in the neighborhood. They are now on the visiting regimen. They are nearby, as opposed to being nebulously off in London somewhere. And that's where we are now. As this chapter opens. Elizabeth was sitting by herself the next morning and writing to Jane while Mrs. Collins and Maria were gone on business into the village, when she was startled by a ring at the door, the certain signal of a visitor. As she had heard no carriage, she thought it not unlikely to be Lady Catherine, and under that apprehension was putting away her half-finished letter that she might escape all impertinent questions, when the door opened, and to her very great surprise, Mr. Darcy, and Mr. Darcy only, entered the room. Little bit confused by that. I've never really known what to make of this. Is it that she expects that she thinks that it's Lady Catherine that she walked because she didn't hear a carriage, or is it that she took a much lighter carriage, a little phaeton, and that maybe that wasn't audible? Surely Lady Catherine never walks from her own house to Hunsford and back, even though it's a tiny distance. Here to Dunkin' Donuts and back. Surely she never does that. But anyway. We don't even have time to wonder about that because suddenly Elizabeth and Darcy are in the room alone together. How many times has that happened in this book? He seemed astonished, too, on finding her alone, and apologized for his intrusion by letting her know that he had understood all the ladies to be within. They then sat down, and when her inquiries after Rosings were made, seemed in danger of sinking into total silence. It was absolutely necessary, therefore, to think of something, and in this emergency, recollecting when she had seen him last in Hertfordshire, and feeling curious to know what he would say on the subject of their very hasty departure, she observed, "How very suddenly you all quitted Netherfield last November, Mr. Darcy. It must have been a most agreeable surprise to Mr. Bingley to see you all after him so soon, for, if I recollect right, he went but the day before. He and his sisters were well, I hope, when you left London?" "Perfectly so, I thank you." She found that she was to receive no other answer, and after a short pause added, "I think I have understood that Mr. Bingley has not much idea of ever returning to Netherfield again." She doesn't want to let Darcy off the hook for talking about Netherfield. "I have never heard him say so, but it is probable that he may spend very little of his time there in the future. He has many friends, and he is at a time of life when friends and engagements are continually increasing." "If he means to be but little at Netherfield, it would be better for the neighbourhood that he should give up the place entirely, for then we might possibly get a family settled there. But perhaps Mr. Bingley did not take the house so much for the convenience of the neighbourhood as for his own, and we must expect him to keep it or quit it on the same principle." "I should not be surprised," said Darcy, "if he were to give it up as soon as any eligible purchase offers." Poor Jane. Oh, imagine him not being at Netherfield. Imagine selling it. A whole new stranger. Netherfield is to be let again. Oh, Elizabeth made no answer. She was afraid of talking longer of his friend, and having nothing else to say, was now determined to leave the trouble of finding a subject to him. He took the hint, and soon began with, "This seems a very comfortable house. Lady Catherine, I believe, did a great deal to it when Mr. Collins first came to Hunsford." "I believe she did, and I am sure she could not have bestowed her kindness on a more grateful object." "Mr. Collins appears very fortunate in his choice of a wife." "Yes, indeed. His friends may well rejoice in his having met with one of the very few sensible women who would have accepted him, and have made him happy if they had. My friend has an excellent understanding, though I am not certain that I consider her marrying Mr. Collins the wisest thing she ever did. She seems perfectly happy, however, and in a prudential light it is certainly a very good match for her." Again, I want to know what their faces are saying while this is going on. Neither one of them has any affection for Mr. Collins, and they both see him exactly for what he is. It must be very agreeable to her to be settled within so easy a distance of her own friends and family. An easy distance, do you call it? It's nearly 50 miles. And what is 50 miles of good road? Little more than half a day's journey. Yes, I call it a very easy distance. I won't stress it here, but one little consideration is here how much easier it was for men to travel at this time than women. "I should never have considered the distance as one of the advantages of the match," cried Elizabeth. "I should never have said Mr. Collins was settled near her family. Mrs. Collins was settled near her family. She's 50 miles away." "It is a proof of your own attachment to Hertfordshire. Anything beyond the very neighbourhood of Longbourn, I suppose, would appear far." As he spoke, there was a sort of smile, which Elizabeth fancied she understood. He must be supposing her to be thinking of Jane and Netherfield, and she blushed as she answered, "I do not mean to say that a woman may not be settled too near her family. The far and near must be relative, and depend on many varying circumstances. Where there is fortune to make the expense of travelling unimportant, distance becomes no evil. But that is not the case here. Mr. and Mrs. Collins have a comfortable income, but not so much as will allow of frequent journeys. And I am persuaded my friend will not call herself near her family under less than half the present distance." Mr. Darcy drew his chair a little towards her, and said, "You cannot have a right to such very strong local attachment. You cannot have always been at Longbourn." What does that question mean? Note the longing in it. I am accustomed to my world, and you cannot possibly. I have stumbled across you at a country house dance in the middle of nowhere. Your people are nothing. How can you be the way you are? Surely you haven't been at Longbourn your whole life. It torments him that she's not different from what she is. Elizabeth looked surprised, as well she should. What an amazing thing for him to say. It cannot have any meaning on the surface. It can only be speaking of this monstrous amount of self-control going on. Elizabeth looked surprised. The gentleman experienced some change of feeling. He drew back his chair, took a newspaper from the table, and glancing over it, said in a colder voice, "Are you pleased with Kent?" A short dialogue on the subject of the country ensued, on either side calm and concise, and was soon put an end to by the entrance of Charlotte and her sister, just returned from their walk. The tete-a-tete surprised them. Mr. Darcy related the mistake which had occasioned his intruding on Miss Bennet, and after sitting a few minutes longer without saying much to anybody, went away. "What can be the meaning of this?" said Charlotte, as soon as he was gone. "My dear Eliza, he must be in love with you, or he would never have called on us in this familiar way." They don't know that he hasn't done this before. It's very familiar, in a way that simply did not happen. They come home and find him just sitting and chatting with her alone in the house. But when Elizabeth told of his silence, it did not seem very likely, even to Charlotte's wishes, to be the case, and after various conjectures, they could at last only suppose that his visit to proceed from the difficulty of finding anything to do, which was the more probable from the time of year. All field sports were over. Within doors there was Lady Catherine, books, and a billiard table, but gentlemen cannot always be within doors, and in the nearness of the parsonage, and the pleasantness of the walk to it, and of the people who lived in it, the two cousins found a temptation from this period of walking thither almost every day. They called at various times of the morning, sometimes separately, sometimes together, and now and then accompanied by their aunt. It was plain to them all that Colonel Fitzwilliam came because he had pleasure in their society, a persuasion which of course recommended him still more, and Elizabeth was reminded by her own satisfaction in being with him, as well as by his evident admiration of her former favourite George Wickham, and though in comparing them she saw there was less captivating softness in Colonel Fitzwilliam's manners, she believed he might have the best informed mind. So there we get a glimpse of what things are like this winter. We get a glimpse of what's going on, that sometimes Lady Catherine and her nephews do often come over to Hunsford to break up the monotony of the winter. And sometimes they come alone and come separately, but nothing like this. Nothing like Darcy just popping in. And also, if there's that much communication between the households, if there's that much in the way of people watching each other come and go and knowing that they come and go, and as we've seen in earlier chapters, talking about coming and going, then are we absolutely sure that Darcy didn't know that she would be alone? I don't know. I wouldn't want to cross him in person by saying that maybe he's fibbing just a little, but I think there's a doubt there. But why Mr. Darcy came so often to the parsonage, it was more difficult to understand. It could not be for society, as he frequently sat there 10 minutes together without opening his lips, and when he did speak, it seemed the effect of necessity rather than of choice, a sacrifice to propriety, not a pleasure to himself. He seldom appeared really animated. Mrs. Collins knew not what to make of him. Colonel Fitzwilliam's occasionally laughing at his stupidity proved that he was generally different, which her own knowledge of him could not have told her. And as she would have liked to believe this changed the effect of love, and the object of that love her friend Eliza, she sat herself seriously to work to find it out. In other words, Darcy does often come over and doesn't speak, just sits there staring at Elizabeth. And we know from Colonel Fitzwilliam that he isn't always like that. That's the key here, is that he's not like that. Fitzwilliam ribs him because he's not like that at Rosings, for instance, or elsewhere in town. She watched him whenever they were at Rosings and whenever he came to Hunsford, but without much success. He certainly looked at her friend a great deal, but the expression of that look was disputable. It was an earnest, steadfast gaze, but she often doubted whether there was much admiration in it, and sometimes it seemed nothing but absence of mind. No, in fact, it's the product of ruthless control, ruthless restraint. She had once or twice suggested to Elizabeth the possibility of his being partial to her, but Elizabeth always laughed at the idea. And Mrs. Collins did not think it right to press the subject, from the danger of raising expectations which might only end in disappointment. For in her opinion it admitted not of a doubt that all her friend's dislike would vanish if she could suppose him to be in her power. In her kind schemes for Elizabeth, she sometimes planned her marrying Colonel Fitzwilliam. He was beyond comparison the pleasantest man. He certainly admired her, and his situation in life was most eligible. But, to counterbalance these advantages, Mr. Darcy had considerable patronage in the church, and his cousin could have none at all. A little bit of... We end on an unfortunate note there, a little bit of very contemporary stuff. Jane Austen's original readers would have understood those allusions in an instant. Without a footnote, they will be hard to understand in the 21st century. Where in 2024, Jane Austen could not have imagined that anyone would remember her name or be reading her books in 2024. But you don't need to worry about it. The point isn't the detail at the end of the chapter there. The point is that suddenly the narrative has introduced Mr. Darcy acting even more strangely than usual. Now, I would say that even when he was at Meryton, he was acting strangely around and towards Elizabeth. Now it's very pronounced. Now no one can miss it, and Charlotte Lucas, who's not exactly the most romantic soul in the world, can readily imagine that it's because he's infatuated with Elizabeth. That's why he keeps showing up, when obviously the company isn't doing it for him. So we are in a chapter of intense restraint, and we will see what comes from there. Something has to, because these two are now in direct proximity with each other every day. Something has to come of it. Something has to happen. So we'll wrap this up for now, and we'll see what happens in the next chapter. Thank you, BookTube.